remarks. So a bit of a definition, right? We're going to handle this just like we handle hate speech, right? The courts will adjudicate on issues where it's brought that someone has made a remark that is deemed to be misogynist or sexist, and will adjudicate it on the same metrics. What we define misogynist and sexist remarks to be is that an essentializing statement based on your gender that confers negative connotations about your gender. That is what misogyny and sexist remarks actually are. That's what we're going to stop. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm first going to make it very clear why these remarks actually matter. And I don't want this to be strawmanned or marginalized by the opposition, because it matters to every woman every day of their life. One second. And secondly, I'm going to deal with why this is the only way that we are going to be able to change this and get the liberation for women that we need. Go.
Okay, how exactly are we going to be prosecuting people for these crimes?
You bring them to court. Jury. And you prosecute the evidence just like we do with hate speech. Right, okay, cool. Let's get on to this idea about why these remarks actually matter. Let's start with how this affects women on a daily basis when they actually hear these remarks. And the first thing you have to understand is that female sexual liberation has been a lie. Female sexual identity is entirely characterized by misogynist remarks and the idea that you are either going to be a prude or a slut, and you'll be shamed either way. You cannot be liberated at the point at which each of your choices are politicized, and none of them will gain you acceptance in any manner. We don't think that in any way you are liberated at the point at which each of your decisions will characterize and essentialize you to a single identity that will then have judgment conferred upon you and people to marginalize you and ostracize you as a result. We think that this is also unique to women, because the way in which the actual patriarchy works in this way is that men aren't actually judged for their sexual practices in the way that women are, whereas women are slut-shamed time and time again for the things that they do, and consistently, always blamed for anything that ever happens to them in terms of sexual assault and rape, because it is obviously a woman's fault that she was enticing a man, because men's sexual desires are not something to be ashamed of, they're something they can't control. But if a woman ever has a sexual desire or acts in a sexual way, obviously she's asking for it. I think it's misogynist remarks that allow people to make jokes about this and make a permissive environment where people can actually chalk up those remarks they actually believe to just a bit of banter and completely sideline criticisms of it as just being the PC brigade and, man, can't you just take a joke? Are exactly the reasons why these things persist, right? Also, what you'll notice is that the basis for why rape and sexual assault is one of the least prosecuted crimes has to do with sexist and misogynist remarks. The first one is women are ashamed to come forward because even if you think it's a bit of banter, women feel judged at the point at which they have to claim that sexual assault happened to them because they are worried about being told that it was their fault. And I will tell you, the worst thing you can ever say to a sexual assault victim is that it was somehow their fault and that they are to blame for something that they've done. And even if the court system doesn't do that, which, by the way, it definitely does. It's why there's a 6% conviction rate for the 1/3 reported sexual assaults. What we would say, in this particular instance, is that women feel as though they will be judged in this manner, and they do not feel empowered to report when someone rapes them. And that is not the duty of the state. That is a massive failure of the state in any possible conception. But the second thing is that these misogynist and sexist remarks are actually things that perpetuate those ideas. The idea that, oh, all women are manipulative, sweetie. Or things like, oh, well, she's really asking for it tonight. Look, she's wearing black lingerie. Obviously, are the things that justify the view that we should let, oh, I don't know, women's clothing the night they got raped be admissible in court. These have actual real-world policy implications for countries and for people, and for the way in which the judicial system and society actually treats victims of sexual assault and rape. We think these are massively problematic. More of what we would say, that not only do you do this, you politicize your gender in an absolutely terrible way. Even if you don't want your gender to be part of your political identity, by being a woman and having to constantly fight against the patriarchy in this way, constantly have to fight against all these misogynist remarks created at you, you have to necessarily politicize your gender as part of your identity. We don't think that that is freedom for women. We think it is absolutely awful, right? Let's talk a bit about why this is a particularly necessary change. Does anyone want to offer a point of information? Also, I say all the true things, it's really nice. Right, okay. So why is this a necessary change? So guys, you have to understand that this type of sexism and this type of misogyny is particularly bad bad because it exists in a realm where you don't actually have discourse. It cannot be discursive because of the way that it is used in casual conversation, in casual context. Why is this the case? First of all, women don't feel empowered to actually challenge misogynist and sexist remarks because A, it's ineffective. You'll just say, oh, you're just being emotional, sweetheart, don't worry about it, right? That's the first thing you get told. But the second thing is there is a massive pressure not to be that feminist in any conversation and to show and prove that you can take a joke that the boys are going to give. So women have an active pressure by knowing that they will be ineffective by ever challenging this and ostracized from the group if they ever do so. So women can't make it discursive. Why can't men make it discursive? Well, men have equal pressures in the same way. First of all, if you do this, you'll just be told you have shit banter, right? And why can't you take a joke, right? That actually doesn't exist in a discursive mechanism. Why is this particularly important? It's important because it means that there isn't a way for society to challenge this without the government making a carte blanche statement that it is unacceptable to make these remarks. It is not just the feminist saying it, it is not just the guy who can't take a joke, but it is the government and it is society saying that this is unacceptable. It is not me personally singling you out, this is society saying, no more are we going to tolerate it. That's the only way we can get change. But moreover, notice that this actually feeds into actions, right? The reason why this is actually going to stop sexist actions is because A, men are now going to be more aware of can this be interpreted as sexist and try to avoid that if they are good people, but moreover it will empower women to feel as though they can come forward when they are treated in a sexist manner. They can come forward because society takes it seriously and is standing beside them saying, we understand that it is an assault to your humanity when you are degraded by sexist language. When you have to work twice as hard and people find it hilarious, or when, she had it coming as a punchline is unacceptable. We are very, very happy to propose this motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. One of the really interesting things before this debate is the number of people walking past preparation who kind of had this strange look and occasional comment saying it's going to be more difficult when it's all men on the opposition. You know what? It is. And you know what? That's the problem in society. It's not an accidental comment. It's not an inappropriate joke. It's not even the fact that somebody might express their inherent and wrong sexist views in a particular way. It's the fact that those views exist and that people act upon them. And actively prosecuting when people say those things, does not change the underlying attitude. It does not empower women. What it says is that women need special protection in society because unlike all of the other groups that are marginalised by the patriarchy, like people of colour, people not of the same class, people not of the same education, like people who happen to be gay or lesbian or intersex or transgendered, you need some sort of special magic protection because you can't stand up for yourself. Points of rebuttal that we would like to raise to some specifics. Not just a moment, thank you. The first one is this assertion that the reason that rape convictions are criminally low is because of the patriarchy, or because of inherent sexism. We think that could play a part. We think it is a massive oversimplification that the collection of evidence is a significant problem. We don't see that prosecuting people who say certain things will guarantee that evidence becomes available more readily or more often. We think it is a part of the problem. We don't think that they can claim that it is the whole of the solution. We also think that it's far more of a problem when suddenly, what you've now got when you want to deal with a difficult circumstance where somebody has said something which is sexist or misogynistic to you, is that your mechanism for dealing with it is now prosecution because there is an active policy by the state. which means what you're suddenly doing in employment and corporate and any other environment where these things are especially harmful is that you are guaranteeing that it now becomes a legal issue and not an internal or a political issue. And the final thing that we would suggest, no thank you very much, is one of the reasons that the feminist movement is not supported widely, perhaps as widely as it should be, is not the characterisation which we have heard that it is okay for there to be sexist banter. It might be because the feminist movement is a highly fractured, disorganised organisation and grouping of groupings with multiple views. We think that that is characteristic of the proposition we have heard, which is that the problems they are trying to solve are far more complex than the solution they put forward. No, thank you, and I'm going to talk about why that solution has specific and particular harms. The special protection point is the first one, not yet, thank you, is the first one that we would like to raise. We think, on our side of the house, that at the moment one of the problems around hate speech and a whole series of issues around politically correct communication probably has gone a bit far on our side, on this side. We think that this is something that maybe ought to be reined back in a whole. We think that when it specifically applies to women, when what women are looking for in society rightly is equality and is to be treated as equals, applying this special protection, this additional measure, which does not apply to any other minority, I'll take it in a moment, stay standing, at any other point in time, actually sends exactly the wrong message. The message that it sends is that the current feminist movement can never achieve these aims. It sends the idea that women cannot stand up for themselves as individuals, that they have to be identified as a collective, and that this collective is weaker or in some way in need of state protection. We think that that is the wrong message to send.
Okay, just a quick question. Why do you think that there is an overwhelming pressure on women to be thin, but not on men?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm looking at me, obviously, I really succumb to pressure. No, look, later. We think that there is huge pressure on all sorts of people to conform in all sorts of ways. We think that advertising and the media has a massive force. We think that rates of anorexia among male teens is increasing. We think things like men's health and, in fact, the massive availability of pornography is, in fact, one of the major reasons that people have issues about their body image. We think that women may be especially subjected to this at the moment. We don't think that that is a result of people making jokes about women, whether they are right, wrong, sexist, or misogynistic. The idea that all sexist comments are going to inherently affect body image is nonsense. No, thank you very much. The second point we would like to raise is this idea about whether this is actually the role and the purpose of the state. Because there is an implicit assumption that under this proposition, the role of the state is to mitigate harm, to significantly reduce the harms that are being caused to people. We think that that is wrong. We think that all sorts of actions we carry out cause harm to others, and it is not the role of the state to stop them. It is the role of the state to prevent what we want to see in society, which is to allow people to express themselves. If I open a small business, I hurt somebody else who hasn't started one. If I vote for a particular political party which benefits me, I necessarily harm somebody else. There is an assumption on the proposition side of the House that what the state's role is to prevent all harm. But the idea is that they must prevent offence, because offence has this natural, tangible knock-on, which has never been proven. No, thank you. We think that there is a disproportionate harm in criminalising somebody for saying something which could be casual, which could be inappropriate, which may not have meant to cause the offence which it caused. Stay standing, I'll take you. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the court process around this is in fact a disproportionate approach and causes a harm that we don't want. Go ahead.
Implicitly, all you're saying is it's true, they didn't mean anything, it's just a joke, get over it. Is that actually your suggestion for how people should deal with these things?
Okay. No, ladies and gentlemen, that isn't what we're saying. We say two things to that. We say in some instances that in fact what somebody might have been doing was making a joke, and what should happen is they should be told that it was wrong, that I was personally offended were I the subject of it, and that they shouldn't do it. What we say is that when this side of the House prosecutes everybody for saying this, what you don't do is you don't change the fact that people are still thinking these things. All you do is you suddenly say, you know what, now when I tell them, I'm being a bit of a rebel. Now when I tell them I'm against the PC brigade, now when I say these things are something where I am reacting to the state going too far. And what's even worse is that it does not stop the underlying attitudes. Let's assume on the second level that it wasn't something that I should not have said that was ill-advised and offensive, and I should be told that and stop. But it is a reflection of my innate and my personal views. What you've now done is suddenly set women up as a victim class protected by the state with an officious prosecution around a political correctness agenda, which the vast majority of people don't want, because what we're now doing is saying that freedom of speech is a lesser right around people, and what we're suddenly doing is saying that we should prosecute people unnecessarily. Ladies and gentlemen, be very, very clear. We don't think that anybody should be marginalised or victimised in our society. However, a law, an active policy on prosecution against people who say these things, does not deal with the problems that are identified if those problems are genuinely systemic in society. It is disproportionate and it is inappropriate. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand with the opposition.
Oh no.
Bullshit reevaluation of our conscious affiliation towards sex. Moreover, I want to tell you thereafter, while linguistic objectification of women has infiltrated our treatment and our perception of women in a significant, important and detrimental way for women, most individual women's lives. What are we told by side opposition? They say in the first case, why can't they express themselves? I mean, aside from the fact that they don't want to take it seriously, we would just all want everyone to be able to express themselves. There's an active part of Pam's case that you choose to ignore. What does she tell you? She tells us every time we wake up in a world in which there are consistent confrontations and assessments made upon what it is to be a certain type of woman, regardless of what type that is, then women live in a scenario that men don't. That is to say that their gender is continually politicized, and the decisions they do or do not make like that are open to a judgment whose state ultimately internalizing their self-identification in a way that doesn't occur for men. Ultimately, what this means, in a simplistic term, is that being a woman is actually as important when I walk down the street by myself, but not for in the same way as it is for being a man. Secondly, they say, look, I mean, it may have been meant casually, or indeed not meant at all. If that's the case, that people are just saying things casually, I actually think that's just the reason why I'm not that hard to cut out, and I'm clearly not really committed to the cause of sexism, so it won't be that big a deal. If it is meant casually, if you can make a rape joke, Madam Speaker, casually, if you can undermine what is basically the death of a genuinely integral part of a woman or indeed a man's identity, casually, then we say that all the more reason why the policy of women needs to go under our serious control. That's why we have to diminish it in some 2-minute piece of rebuttal, probably repetitious actually. Then he tells you, right, that you're effectively, that they can stand up for themselves, and that if they have to run to the court system, they don't look like they can stand up for themselves. Well, first of all, top tip, they let women be lawyers now. But also, right, we actually think that what allows women to look weak is the fact that every man who makes sexist remarks knows all they can do reading them is now about their feelings. I think it's actually a pretty strong statement to say, I'm going to take you to court. We actively think that is a stronger and more detrimental to individual men and more threatening than like having a bit of a hissy fit about it. So we do think it is, in fact, an effective way of standing up for yourself. More importantly, right, we think that they say all this with respect to diminishing women's position as they can be in the world on our side of the head. They never tell you substantively why allowing this casual banter to continue is ever going to get better under their side of the house without this policy. We think that's imperative, given that they don't know why it is we shouldn't be eradicating such a harm. The last thing Jason tells us is that treating women in a special way probably makes them feel inadequate or unimportant. Like, frankly, in the first place, I'm happy to be patronized if it means I get to be paid the same as my brother. I'm happy to be patronized if it means my husband can't rate me, and I'm certainly happy to be patronized as a gay woman or as a black woman or indeed as a black or gay man if I should be given exhaustive hate speech. He doesn't tell you that it's patronized. And here's the thing. I think a lot of men aren't sexist. I think a lot of those same men make sexist remarks and misogynist remarks in a couple of different ways. First, some of the times because they freely don't take a statement that says they're going to cause that much harm, or they don't realize that they're saying could be even taken up as sexist. What's the problem with that? Those men who would advocate for their treatment and for a high quality life for women understand the consequences of how those very things. So in the first instance, with those men, it makes and forces a reflection of self, a reflection of their actions, and their capacity to aid in the feminist cause or the egalitarian or whatever you want to remind yourself. Secondarily, you think that women have to live in a paradigm where there is a continual assessment of their femininity and its worth or its causes, say, in terms of how they are affected. We think in that sense you just eradicate the likelihood of our daughters having to listen to whether or not it's even up for debate that they are of less value. Because they don't internalize whether or not they have to fight against the patriarchy and ultimately probably are more liberated both sexually and in terms of advocating for what it is they would like to do with their individual lives. More importantly, they tell you though, listen, we're obviously simplifying the rape issue, but actually it's also down to evidence, and evidence is really hard to find. Like meeting all the men on the SI to find them is really super difficult. Here's the thing, the reason that rape is so hard to prosecute their threat is because there's extreme difficulty in finding evidence. There's no reason why that is, because majoritively, women don't actually come forward or men come forward early enough. Why is that? Because we genuinely believe that there is an entrenched shame around this crime which is actively harmed every single time that crime is committed as a serious one. You don't report something because you don't think it's that big a deal, or you worry that you shouldn't think it's that big a deal. And certainly not helps when somebody who you know and like made a joke about it before that has happened. You think that is actively undermining that case. But more importantly, right, we think people take whatever evidence you do get less seriously, and we think that there are jokes continuously about how women make accusations of rape when they're not true. That's exactly why in this country we have a judge tell people, well, I mean, a woman who was wearing skinny jeans could never be raped because they're really difficult to get over. Then we think, when they say like, and that it's, like, when we think that there's an internalization of this, and as well, I mean, they can just think about themselves differently, because the fact that you can't be, in any way, an active decider about what to hear is a problem, and in that sense, an absolute valid. Moreover, we say, we're telling you, by the way, that individuals can just stand up to their bosses and against the fact that this is so conditional and circumstance-based, because in the instances where a man feels comfortable making sexist or misogynist remarks, most likely a place where you also won't have great regrets to that sexist remarks. You're probably in charge. The other thing we can linguistic objectification of the women as actively influencing women that change our treatment and acceptable perceptions of sex. There is a distinct reason that people are objectify women sexually more often. When you walk into a magazine where there are more women, even if there are men, there are more naked women on magazines than there are ever men. There's a reason. But excluding anorexia, there's one exception, probably a mental illness more than anything else. There's a bigger reason why generally women feel pressure to be thin and not to be strong. And even in terms of pressures on men, no Adam speakers of those pressures are to be strong. Whereas the starvation of women actively undermines their strength, actively tells them they should not be in any families because there's a place for them, which is ultimately compounded by continual sexualization of those sexes and a continual mockery of anyone who doesn't fit their effect.
In opposing a motion that is essentially like liberal pornography, it provides individuals to basically outline sexist views that exist, claim it would be nice to do something about them, and consequently claim something that has no real psychological basis, that the use of slight remarks actually has an impact in creating those attitudes. The reality is, even in societies, you can pull your chair out and try and distract the joke if you want. Even in societies where you have complete liberalism, and where you have a complete taboo against misogynist remarks, you also have latent attitudes that don't get dealt with. What's important is creating a kind of discursive space where individuals don't simply displace their sexism to areas where they're not going to be challenged, but instead you do get that continual process of challenge. What I'm going to talk about are two things. Firstly, broadly, proportionality and why the benefits from this are not going to justify the fact that we will literally ruin some people's lives for something that Catherine accepts for many people is not something they are actively choosing to try and hurt. Second, we're going to talk about feminism and the way in which people receive social messaging. How it's not really true that the criminalisation of speech has led to the disavowal of those attitudes. It actually just seems like people are making a fuss, and the PC brigade is coming out again in situations that we do want to change. So, first of all, it is true that any criminalisation may lead to a change in social attitude, but that obviously has to be balanced against the fact that in giving somebody a criminal record, you literally ruin their lives, right? For something that is not necessarily a conscious decision, it's very difficult for them to be employed. It's extremely difficult for them to operate in society. Now, only government can call all the rhetoric they want about the kind of harm that this causes. But I'm really seriously questioning, A, whether or not the people who make these kinds of comments are aware of that kind of harm, or have ever been made aware of it, or aware that they're doing it in that kind of situation, given that the attitude presumably already exists at the time they make those comments. But secondly, whether or not you are going to think more in an environment where people are drunk and joking, the fact that you might go to prison was more likely people just think, oh yeah, I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm going to anyway because it's risque to do. No thanks. So there are a few harms that presumably arise from this. The first one is this idea of confrontation with assessment. In the first place, people are still likely to say these kinds of things in the kinds of environments they want to talk about, right? In exclusively masculine environments where people egg each other on, you're very unlikely to be subject to the threat of criminal penalty, not least because your friends are very unlikely to report you to the police for what you've said. We'd like that is just absurd, right? In that case, you don't change the kind of attitude that you want. What you do is catch out the unaware, right? So you don't change the attitudes, you just ruin a few people's lives with that conflict. So the benefit's not particularly great. No thanks. But what caused the particular attitudes and harmful that meant no thank you was that these are latent attitudes, right? Caused by things like the objectification and commodification through different means and media. Because the way people react to words is generally critical, right? If somebody hears something that is misogynist, they interpret and understand that as a comment about women. The thing that shapes people's attitudes is the fact that, say, advertising constantly portrays women as thin. The fact that pornography does the same, right? The fact that all of those things leads to a kind of subliminal, non-critical interpretation of those messages. They don't go away on their side of the house, right? So you don't change the attitudes, you simply get a lack of the thing that you remember critically anyway, right? So in that case, you don't really start to change the attitudes, but again, you do catch out the unaware. No chance. But the third thing on this is you do create a kind of risque allure in engaging in those kinds of attitudes. One of the big problems with taboos around racism and around sexism is for a large number of people, that becomes the attraction in saying it, right? The fact that it's taboo, the fact that society tries to condemn it, or society that you don't relate to tries to condemn those attitudes, when the disjunct between societal attitudes and the law, people almost always choose social attitudes and choose that as an allure to prove they're risque and to prove that they're not going to be counted. That's why political correctness has such a bad name virtually everywhere. Because people do think of it as something that oppresses them. They don't see it as changing their attitudes.
Okay, given that this policy won't be secret, and given that now you won't just occasionally happen to say it, you'll have to make an active choice to be rebelling against this new legislation, the only people who will continue to do it are those people who intend to defend it.
I mean, I really don't think people, I don't think people speak to each other like that. I don't think there's that level of thought that goes into it. Anybody who has ever said anything that has upset somebody will know that very often you are either unintentionally rude, or you say things in the heat of the moment. You don't get that kind of continual thought process, otherwise there'd be quite a long pause before anybody replies. Eradicated all behaviour that it tries to eradicate. Like, I don't want to refuse the criminal law. You say, no, I can go to prison for that. In a situation where, crime still happens, notwithstanding that there are criminal offences, means that you don't One of the few other realistic implications. They also dealt with this problem of sexual assault, right? I mean, this is just something that it's not really in the debate, but it's just kind of important and educative. One of the major reason why people don't come forward for sexual assault is self-reinforcing. The fact that prosecution rates are themselves so low, and the fact that where it's one person's word against another, it's so difficult to change people's minds, right? And it's so difficult to prove that beyond reasonable doubt. It has nothing to do with social attitudes, and even if it was, those social attitudes still exist in the mind of police officers who are disciplined for saying these kinds of things, and they still are extremely misogynist in their interpretation. So, what else did Jason do? He told you that it's strange that you have to turn, as a feminist, to an overwhelmingly patriarchal system in order to be able to manifest sexual equality. One of the problems for feminism has always been the idea that women are, for some reason, unequal, that women are weak and in need of special protection. There's no better way of reinforcing that people are so precious that they need, that they actually manifest, that people are so precious that they need the law to protect them from what people say in everyday conversation. In that case, you don't start to think, well, I shouldn't be saying those things. You instead devalue the feminist movement itself. That's what builds into the idea and the logic and language of political correctness, of the PC Brigade. The idea that feminists are anti-fun, as Pam talked about, is re-entrenched to the point where conversations are criminalised at the behest of the feminist movement. In that sense, you don't bring about the kind of change that you want. You instead just ruin the lives of a few people who are unwary, and the attitudes stay very well. I'm not very
tells us this speech must be alright, and that free speech is something that is alright. That's particularly important to recognize. It is the case, therefore, that what actually happens is that people become complicit in their own placement within certain categories, because certain jokes exist within our society, and I'll get on to why they exist a little bit later. And because jokes are jokes, perhaps they're not serious. Aren't we all liberal anyway? And we all know this isn't actually truly the case. But the fact of the matter is that we don't make those jokes about black people, for instance, because there are those lines in the sand. Those jokes existing at all within our society, being alright at all, means that we place people within certain locales. So the message to men is still, you're not a real man unless you are uncaring. That being caring is something that is not a manly thing to do, and that's the way that jokes within society will perpetuate themselves. It's the same in terms of women and the jokes that we always hear about making sandwiches and stuff like that. Like, obviously the joke isn't taken at face value, we must believe, but the underlying messages, those actions that we get all of the time in our daily lives, mean that we are reinforced into those roles to some extent, that we do feel like we fall out of those roles, and we happen to not be particularly strong as a man, or we are particularly emotional. So that people are placed within the locale specifically because of the status quo legal protections, which make those kinds of speech all right, and something which is going to happen more often as people go about their daily lives. Yeah.
Given that this environment is one which does not accept or should not accept misogyny, why did about 20-odd people in this audience laugh when you made that comment about making a sandwich?
Because those are the kinds of jokes that people think are funny, because like some people think are funny, because they come from mainstream culture, which is not my second point, that how we change the kind of jokes that people like Frankie Boyle and Joe Grant can make. So those are not gender essentializing jokes. And that's particularly important to look at, right? Because people are kind of trained to laugh at that make a sandwich joke. Not because they think they're funny, but just because whenever they've been existing in society before, people have laughed when those things happen. So you feel a compulsion to laugh anyway. It's not particularly because jokes are funny that you do it. Like in the same way that when you watch a really funny film for the 20th time, you still laugh at some of the jokes because you remember that they're funny, even though obviously it's 5 years later. Anyway, why are people less likely to say it? What I've already kind of getting into, right? So most people don't actually want to be funny. They don't actually want to be sexy. They genuinely think that they're not being sexist when they make jokes about different people's roles. They think that those things are fine. No thanks. They think that people are able to deal with that, that they're not reinforcing anything, even though they clearly are. I've already told you those messages reinforced very much. So what we have now is we make people less likely to say it. Firstly, simply because of the massive effect of public prosecution. And there is a very strong messaging effect there, which we think is fairly accepted. That's prosecution can bring about, and that people are afraid, especially when they're hanging out in clubs, and they can be overheard, and that someone's going to take offense and actually bring it up. And they're much more likely to bring it up when they're empowered to go to court with that. But more importantly, you change the kind of comedic world in which people live by changing the TV shows and the comedians that can operate and how they can operate. Because they are the ones who are definitely going to get prosecuted for anything they say, because they're filmed, because of things that are recorded, and so therefore can go up at any time. So you no longer have Joe Brown joking about her husband watching the match of the day and being particularly uncaring. You can no longer have Frankie Boyle making jokes about where women should be and all of that sort of thing. What it means is that people don't think those jokes are funny anymore, because they don't hear those jokes anymore, because those things aren't part of our popular culture anymore. The vast majority of jokes that we make to our friends are not the real jokes that we happen to have come up with, because we're not comedians. We tend to quote people we've heard before, and once the people we've heard before can no longer make these jokes, then it is very clearly the case that in casual conversation we're no longer making these jokes. So yes, there may be a time lag effect, as Brenda might want to have to believe, but those things get gradually taken out once the popular culture is no longer a popular culture that is misogynistic. As that's the messaging effect that brings to bear so much upon the comedy that we find funny, we think we get rid of that outside proposition.
three things I'm going to talk about in constructive today. First thing we're going to talk about is responses to criminalisation, why we think continuing prevalence of social attitudes is probably problematic. We point you to like examples that currently happen. Secondly, we're going to talk about verbal signifiers. We're going to give you a direct response to the stuff that we come out of Catherine in terms of linguistic understanding of this debate. Thirdly, we're going to talk about ownership of the feminist cause, how we can actually bring about change and actually allow the contributions of things like cultural feminism, which everyone seems so keen on. Before that, like all of my remarks is going to be integrated by two very quick things that came out of Mark's speech, the rest will be integrated. Like, the first thing is, in order to tackle these kinds of humours, one of the big things he picks up on is the fact that individuals are conditioned into thinking certain things are funny because of their prevalence within things like stand-up comedy. Like, as has kind of already been hinted at by first opposition, we think there's also a counter-effect at the point at which we also tend to find things which are taboos to be funny as a result of the fact that breaking that social norm inherently feels rebellious, but also feels amusing at the point at which we recognise someone else doing it. Like, at best we end up with a wash. That's why people find Frankie Boyle funny in the first place, is because he breaks those taboos. Secondly, like, he comes up, we get this idea of, like, people are afraid of breaking the law, or at least being overheard breaking the law in somewhere like a pub. Like, what we say the problem is with this is that when we don't tackle the underlying issues, which we're going to talk about when we don't, are constructive, is that all we see is the reinforcement of the kind of old boys club that is exactly the problem that women face currently in society when we look at things like employment within any of the mainstream professions. Like, we just see reinforcement, because that's the place where you can use your own sense of humour, which is now illegal. So, first point, responses to criminalisation. No. Like, Pam gives you a lot of analysis about why it is that we have essentially, like, attitudes that are prevalent that refer to sexism as banter. Like, brand. That's true. Like, what they fail to understand is the way that people ultimately respond to criminalisation is worryingly similar to the way that they respond to people who shout them down for sexism in the first place under the status quo. They will turn around and say, but it's just banter, it's still us just having a laugh. It's not entirely clear why an individual will ultimately have their entire value set change in response to women particularly, as well as men, as Mark wants to point out, in that nothing changes beyond now they just have the fear of being overheard and being punished for expressing an attitude. Like, we look at things like equal employment law and the fact that people can still be afraid of the law in terms of punishing them for discriminating against women. That doesn't mean that discrimination against women in the workplace has gone away in terms of things like that. Like, we think that's particularly damaging when we consider images of both the feminist movement but also women. Like, there is a reason why, if you read the pages of the Telegraph or the Sun, when someone takes an action to support the feminist cause, they're referred to as feminazis. It's because they're viewed as somehow clamping down on your ability to do what you want. That's also the reason that we tend to look at things like the essentialization of women in society. When Catherine says that under the status quo, you're looked at as being petty for the fact that you're shouting someone down for making a banter comment, you're probably going to be looked at as being more petty at the point at which you get someone put in prison for making a comment that you view as banter. We're not entirely sure why any of that changes. We think that's particularly problematic when we turn around and say that, like, we have a general attitude within society which has said that the removal of people's freedom of speech is stretching things too far because things are just seen as offensive. We'll point you to the recent cases in UK courts about someone who wore a t-shirt advocating the death of police and got put in prison. Every newspaper carries a story about why that was a bad thing to say, but ultimately wasn't worth suppressing someone's freedom of speech for. We think exactly the same thing happens when it comes to these kinds of things. Secondly, verbal signifiers. I'll take some at the end of my talk. I promise. Mark stands up at the beginning of his rebuttals and turns around and says, like, the big thing is that none of us will say the N-word anymore while referring to black people. That's probably true. Guess what? Racism still exists. The attitude that lays behind me labeling someone by the N-word still exists. We think the same can be largely true as we sit down, please, a way it refers to sexist attitudes. Like, the claim that Catherine essentially makes is that what these kinds of phrases and jokes do is act as essentially a linguistic signal of an attitude that is underlying. What her claim is, though, by removing that linguistic signal, we remove the attitude behind it. That's not how these things work. Ultimately, that is a directional relationship which is reciprocal. If we eliminate one, the same can continue to exist in terms of the fact that we will simply refer to it by another way. We will express that attitude by another method. The removal of of those kinds of phrases doesn't remove the attitude that underlies it. Ultimately, even if we do remove that kind of attitude, we think it's problematic, because now we don't have the common parlance way to refer to that attitude existing in society in a way that represents the experience of the majority of the population, which prevents us from tackling that attitude on a meaningful level when we recognise that it's something that will take over.
Okay, so yes, sexism might still exist in some cases, but at least women both feel attacked by the comments made every day. How does that change under your system when I explain that it doesn't exist in a discursive environment right now?
Okay, we think when the attitude continues to exist, we say that that is expressed in a different way. People will still be victims of sexism. That's the entire point of the second point to deal with that. Third thing, ownership of the feminist cause. Like, we think ultimately what this kind of motion does, the point at which we accept the fact that it is the state's responsibility to enforce this kind of mechanism, is that we remove the kinds of things which allowed cultural feminism, the kind of stuff Trump was so keen on, in emerging in the first place. What we create is a legitimate or effective form of feminism, which somehow is able to trump that discourse at the point at which, if you want to get things changed, people will move towards it because that is the legitimate form. What we need within society is the ability to have a plurality of approaches to the feminist cause and a plurality of approaches to deal with these kinds of problems, which is only possible at the point at which we don't have a status quo feminism or a feminism that people will constantly refer back to because that's the form of feminism that's ingrained in the state. They want more cultural feminism, they want the next wave of feminism. We need to be able to have women and the feminist cause in charge of the kinds of things that they're actually enacting. For those reasons, I'm very glad to stand on opposition.
One time, a friend of theirs who was a girl laughed at it, so probably it's not sexist. I understand that the people who are intentionally offensive may continue to do so. At least we have recourse to actually stopping them from it being deemed a legitimate thing to do and a thing that everyone else should find funny. The other people who don't think about it now are given pause to think about it because no one makes a joke when you know that 95% of people who hear it will go, alright, that's a bit weird, overstepped it there. At which point you can actually get this discussion when the norm moves from tells you from accepting this and being a whiny bitch you complain to it being a thing that you genuinely shouldn't say because people do honestly take laws into account in moderating their behaviour, as Pete concedes when he says we don't say the N-word. So the only problem he's left with is that some people will still say it, intending to cause offence that racism still exists. I mean, like, genuinely, we weren't going to take the burden on and be like, yeah, people who hate women, they'll be grand under this policy. No, that's fine, but what they will is, instead of making women feel awkward when they make these comments, they will have to feel awkward and try and restrict their behaviour so that maybe they might say it in an old boys club, but they won't say it occasionally without thinking about it. They'll have to feel awkward as opposed to the women they inflicted on, where it's targeted towards women. It also, when it's no longer prevalent, because most people will now just think about it in a way they haven't previously, so it means those women are free from those gender roles and expectations on them. If people secretly think sexist things, that is much less impactful because I'm not being told on a daily or weekly basis about those certain expectations that are implicitly applied and should apply to me. That's different because even if you want to secretly do it, let the person who's in the wrong and misogynist feel awkward instead of the people they inflict that misogyny upon. So, one, when people are less likely to say it. Two, when the status quo brings back entrenched gender roles. So, like Mark talked about, we don't think they're positionally responding to it. But essentially what we did get from Pete was the idea that, that look, the response to criminalisation will be that some people do it as a taboo. Those people have listened to the law, understood that the state has deemed it an unacceptable practice, and chosen to breach that new norm. At that point, they are conscious that they are causing offence and causing women to moderate their behaviour in response to those comments, and they are choosing to do so anyway for the sake of the law. I mean, I don't think it's actually that much of a sacrifice to request people to alter their comedy content slightly in response to how much it affects the people that they target for it. So if those people continue to make those jokes, they will be prosecuted for one. That's like an incredibly different thing to happen as opposed to now. And also, those people will have had to intend offence, so you're not just ruining innocent people's lives, much as Jack wants to tell you that that's might be what happens. It's not going to be a secret. We're going to tell you that the policy is being introduced and why the policy is being introduced. I would imagine that goes along the lines of, women aren't just offended when you hurt them physically, you can also make them moderate their behaviour and feel less comfortable when you casually don't think about remarks that you make and the ways in which you make men or women feel that they're supposed to act. I think the explanation will clarify it to many people hearing the policy, so it's no longer a problem to those people. That's likely to say, people who don't think it, we make them think. That's a massive step from accepting that it happens and we can't do anything without it. I guess we'll keep it as a political issue where occasionally we mention it, but understand it's unenforceable. We don't think that's good enough. Second, the only reason the vast majority of people say it is because they assume it will be taken as a joke. That woman or that man will laugh along and not internalize it. They don't realize that a gradual build-up of these things do cause people to moderate their behavior. So at the point where you can make a joke and then be like, oh sorry, I overstepped the line, and assume that that person will never internalize it or never moderate the behavior in the future, that just means you continue to get away with it. Because probably nothing will change. That's not true when you're the person who's being targeted by those jokes. So notice that some people will be deterred by prosecution, and some people, if they bring it up now, you can't just pull that girl or that guy being whiny, because the state has recognised that it's not being whiny, that it is something that actually causes people to be offended and make people feel less comfortable. It's not just that you're delicate or precious, it's that honestly, it is an issue. I think it's good information if you want to give me.
Okay then. Assuming that we accept that the charity Stonewall knows what it's doing, if everything in your analysis is correct, why are they running a campaign against the use of homophobic language and not running a campaign and lobbying for its criminalisation?
I mean, like, maybe they think this policy wasn't on the table. We put it on the table, we're propositions. Just because they're unfortunately lowering their expectations, because they realise how unbelievably entrenched these things are, that maybe people will try and not enjoy them. It doesn't mean that our policy wouldn't be the ultimate things they would love to have in changing attitudes. So it doesn't work. That's what bringing men and gender into gender then, as a result of this. Well, given that the state has already admits the line of creating harm, it already admits that you can be offended by words in certain instances. So things like hate speech. They understand that some people can be affected and some people will moderate their behavior. They noticeably do not say that misogyny will make you moderate your behavior, but unfortunately it does. So people can say, but I'm a feminist, but I just also feel like you're a therapist, and you probably do too. Stop being so nosy. If that's the line you have, then it isn't simply a case of people like intending anything. It's just a case you're left where you can't complain as an individual. If you leave the burden of people falling on it without a state policy to back it up, there is no reason to suggest that the vast majority of people agree with you when you say that it's wrong and people will be offended. No thanks. When the state has agreed that it is damaging, and not just because you're overly sensitive, but because genuinely it is, that's different. That's when you no longer get the idea of being a feminazi. Because it's not you taking a step too far, it's recognition that that is something that does affect the vast majority. So really, the only reasons that they seem to give, or even that we won't eradicate the idea of misogyny entirely, or that some people who are pretty misogynist will use it as an excuse to blame women, even if it's not just women the policy affects, which is true. They're not good enough reasons not to implement it. They never told you why, if we don't do this, a number of individuals who are getting called feminazis will be able to make a change. They never told you why anything would change. All they told you is that they're just like people are taking themselves too seriously. He tells me this, and he's like, yeah, but we've got workplace legislation, and some people are still misogynist. Yes, but it is a relative and comparative game. So at the point where you can't eradicate people's behaviour without law, you can moderate it, so that in the vast majority of instances, people don't get away with it. If we move it one step further, it's simply a case of less things being accepted. People don't come up with their own jokes, and people don't tell jokes that they think are like overtly racist at the moment. When people are told that you should laugh along, and when there's no policy like this, it's assumed that will never impact on anyone. We get to make that change and make people realise that it's not a one-off remark, but something that actually might stay with the people you say it to. At that point, we correct for casual misogyny and we punish those intentionally hurt the people they target with. Both of those things are far better than the lack of a policy they suggest.
Let's be fair to the side proposition in this debate today. What they did was give us an excellent understanding of the links between language and the necessity of misogyny that occurs from that. But what is actually important in this debate today? The point is, at the point that you criminalise behaviour, that doesn't necessitate that firstly, that language goes away, and secondly, that misogyny goes away. If this motion is to work, and if this motion is to be passed, it has to work because of the wider signal it sends out about the state's action about misogyny and the necessary signals it sends about the feminist movement. And that's why we win. And I'm going to talk about two debates today on that, which, let's face it, was all the stuff that people do anyway. Firstly, about the criminalisation and why this damages it. And secondly, the effects this has on the feminist cause. Before I do that, just one quick response to Christine's attack on Pete's material. Firstly, she said that what you now have to do is actually, when the state criminalises it, it's the misogynists that feel awkward, and that's why they stop. That only works at the point at which you change misogynist attitudes in the first place. Considering this debate is about whether you haven't changed misogynist attitude, you can't necessitate that they will feel awkward about whether that occurs. But she said further to that actually this shows that it's unacceptable, and made a point about how the law frames norms. That's not good enough. It's not good enough because all of the stuff Pete gave you about ignoring the understanding of what turns people off the feminist cause, and particularly what happened in the 1980s with the second wave feminist movement. And also about how people are so misogynist, and using the analysis of first proposition about how it's so culturally ingrained, they just can't say that that's something that necessarily will happen. Let's move on to my main case, so firstly about criminalisation. What first I told you is this is a disproportional response. And we think that's true, and it's even more important because they admitted it's a somewhat subconscious decision, and therefore it's a thing. The reason why hate speech is often different is usually when these people are prosecuted, they're actively aware. But what's important about the impact of this has on views on women, which is what he gave you, no thanks. The problem with the feminist movement is that actually when you look at the feminist movement and when it became widespread and when it had impact on the views of men, is when it didn't depend on the militant feminism that occurred in the 1980s. Actually, things like third wave feminism were far more popular in getting people to discuss these issues, even if they don't necessarily agree with the outcome. That's why people think Naomi Wolf, why people like Naomi Wolf are far more popular than people like Catherine McKinnon, and why people have probably more heard of Naomi Wolf in the first place. No thanks. So what's important about this? What this is, therefore, because of the disproportionality, is an incredibly military action to what is actually a minor transgression by people, or at least in the eyes of how they view it. It's disproportionate because people themselves see it as banter, both men and women, as side proposition acknowledged all the way along this debate. Why is that bad? Because what this is seen, therefore, is this seen as justice being done by the 50% of women for the 50% of women. And that's true because they said that these misogynist attitudes are so widespread, and that's why this won't be a popular motion. But what this further does is it actually reinforces the narrative of feminism being of a militant nature. Now, why is that important? Because if they don't believe in this justice, and they don't believe in the judgments that are given, that means that the messages that are created from this don't have any impact on their misogynist attitudes in general and how people perceive of themselves when they don't see that justice is fair and they don't see that it's something legitimate. First prop said that actually people at least, even if that's not true, become more aware when it's a law in the first place. But what's actually important? One of the worst ways in which misogynist attitudes build up in general is men talking about men about women, and the kind of banter that occurs from that. But now they have a cause to which they can go, because they really can say in the minds of them that they are crazy bitches and they're going after us. And that's what's so damaging about them, that they have the ability to perpetuate their bad attitudes, which we really hate. So secondly, what does this say about the feminist cause? Now what is this, and what actually happens here? Because we think, as Pete told you, that this undermines the feminist movement in general. Why? Because essentially what it seems as the state is taking ownership of the feminist cause. Now what's the problem with that? It actually says that particularly when all the argument they made on side proposition said that the state and a lot of the time and the patriarchy are the ones who are perpetuating this, it said that the feminist movement and the movement of women couldn't actually handle this and couldn't achieve any change. Why is that problematic? Because it's just wrong. Because the feminist movement, for example, in the US, was influential in passing the Equal Pay Act, and it was pressured by that movement in getting them to do that. So what does this say? It says that the state was the one that had to take this role. Go on. No, we can actually say both. We can say that how these people will perceive these judgments and perceive this justice isn't something that they're going to like, and therefore it doesn't change misogynist attitudes in general. That's why the case on proposition is flawed, because they made the presumption that this removes misogynist discourse, when in fact it doesn't, because the law can't prosecute people all of the time. They have to prove that this changes misogynist attitudes in general, and we don't think it does. So what does this say? It's particularly bad because in state structures like politics and like political spheres and the legal system, it is predominantly men, and it's predominantly men who control these spheres. And so now what you actually get is it's men who are the ones who are taking ownership of the feminist cause. Why do we think that's bad? Because the message that it sends out says that women couldn't do it, and says that that wasn't something that they could see as possible. Let's be fair, ladies and gentlemen, we couldn't be much more disadvantaged in this debate being an all-male side against 3 women's speakers in this. But the point is, they gave us an understanding of why misogyny and language contribute to each other. They didn't tell us about how this solves that, and for these reasons, we think we will. For those